These are the oldest stories, online at oldeststories.net. You can support the show over on oldeststories.net or by joining as a YouTube channel member or on Patreon. Everyone's support really means a lot to me, and without your support, this podcast would probably end about as badly as the reign of King Shalmaneser V. Our story today opens in 727 BCE. Tiglath-Pileser, Tiglath-Pileser III, has just had one of the most momentous reigns in an empire full of momentous reigns, reforming many troubled institutions and more than doubling the size of the Assyrian Empire in just 18 years. Through all this, his sons have been watching and growing under their father's tutelage, forming themselves into the very model of kingship. Unusual among Assyrian royal families, we actually know three of these sons. One with the personal or familial name of Ululayu, one named Sin-Ahusher, and one whose name we aren't quite sure of, but who's going to play a role in the story later. All three of these, now either young men or possibly full men by 727, have been given important government postings by their father, and Ululayu has been both some sort of either governor or general magnate in the west of the empire for some time, and then in recent years he's been named crown prince. Now, as crown prince, Ululayu stayed in the capital city of Kalhu to handle business while his father Tiglath-Pileser was away. First, Tiglath-Pileser was out on campaign against Damascus, and then during the conquest of Babylonia at the tail end of his reign, he still had his son there in the capital, sort of acting as a deputy and handler of problems. There is an assumption that surely his father must have taken him along on military expeditions in order to learn the craft, but there was also quite a lot of work to do back home, and the king spent far longer away from the capital than was previously normal for Assyrian kings to do. And so Ululayu may have been a general-purpose domestic manager for the empire while his father was busy with war. Now, 2 episodes back, which I know was quite a long time ago, we did a special about the 4 mistakes of Tiglath-Pileser, and mentioned very briefly at the end that the last mistake was Ululayu, who would take the throne name of Shalmaneser V. And from one perspective, Tiglath-Pileser did exactly the right thing. He selected one among his sons many years before his death, named him the crown prince, then put him to work in the capital to gain experience, gain connections, and really get people comfortable with taking orders from the man who will be king. But for all that Tiglath-Pileser had followed the right procedures, he had chosen the wrong subject. Whatever the personal merits of Ululayu might have been, he may have been a very good and loyal son, who knows, but he was a deeply mediocre administrator. Now, he wasn't pants-on-head foolish, and he probably could have made a fine life for himself as sort of a mid-level scribe or overseer, but the challenges that were presented to the Assyrian Empire during his reign were, I have to say, I think, notably less significant than the challenges that had been faced by most other Assyrian kings since 935. And despite this, he still managed to fall short of what was required to meet those challenges. Now, unlike most kings, before they take the throne, we actually have some letters from Ululayu which he sent while working as crown prince. And they show us a man who could competently manage the logistics involved in the delivery of maybe some ice or maybe some building materials down to the capital. And for an empire built on logistics, it's good that he had a handle on this. At the same time, however, we do see an episode where some envoys are disrespecting him by refusing his travel commands, and they need to end up being detained. And that's not really a great start to things. There is, I should mention, a good deal of controversy about the identity of his wife and his mother, because there is a fairly prominent burial of a woman named Iaba and Atalia, and we know that Shalmaneser had a queen named Banitu. And there's an open question as to whether some of these are the same woman or how they're all related to each other and to the kings of this era. But for all the wall of textual speculations around this family drama, the fact is that none of them really matter. Every Assyrian king had many wives, some of whom will have outlived him, and sometimes you will get two women with the same name when they have common names like Iaba. Ultimately, while we speculate that there was competition among the various women of the royal harem, we don't actually know directly that who was the mother of who actually had any real impact on succession. And even if we did know that there was politicking between the various women and their sons, the details of that are wholly lost to us. The one thing we can say for sure is that Shalmaneser was not actually sleeping with his own mother, even if he somehow became married to her in a legal sense through the royal line of succession and inheritance. But there's also good reason to think that he didn't marry his mother even in the legal sense. And that's about all we can say. This has been your Women in History moment. One more reminder that women rarely appear in Mesopotamian history because they very rarely matter in the things which drive our understanding of Mesopotamian history narratives, at least, which are politics and war. Anyway, on the death of Tiglath-Pileser in 727, Ululayu ascended peacefully to the throne and took the throne name of Shalmaneser, meaning the peaceful one, a title of the god Ashur is foremost. Now, something I didn't realize before, but not only is this a throne name, it seems that it's only ever a throne name, as unlike some other royal names in history, we don't know of any Shalmaneser's other than the 5 Assyrian kings who took that name. So it's always a throne name picked by a person upon ascending to kingship. Anyway, this gets mangled in biblical Hebrew as Shalmaneser, and this is actually the Shalmaneser who does show up in the Bible. And I should note that every major Mesopotamian king from this point until the end of Mesopotamian history is almost always far better known by their biblicized name than by their actual name. And so after thinking about it for longer than I really should have, I'm going to continue to mostly follow the scholarly Western convention of using the biblical names rather than the authentic names, just because for this set of kings, as you go from here on forward, the scholarship is just so decided on following the biblical conventions. That's all for historical reasons mostly, but that doesn't concern us here. We know very little about Shalmaneser V in general because his annals have not been found. Now, many kings have had their annals go undiscovered, but in Shalmaneser's case, it's widely believed that his annals were actually destroyed by his successor. And so, there are limits to what we can say about his career. He took the throne probably in January of 726, which would have still been the 10th month of 727 by Assyrian reckoning, so he didn't have enough time for any military campaigns right off the bat, as the king's first New Year ceremony, which happened in spring, rather around the same time as the traditional Jewish Passover, was ceremonially very important. Rather more concerning is that the eponym lists tell us that he spent his first year exactly where he had spent the last few years, in the land, meaning just in the heartland doing politics and policy, rather than out on the frontier conquering. And to spend your first year not murdering foreigners, that's always a bad start for an Assyrian king. Now, he did have a rather more busy coronation New Year than most kings had up until now, because he ascended at the same time to the thrones of Ashur and of Babylon. Again, little is known here, but we do have some letters and disputes getting settled in Shalmaneser's name during his reign that attest that he did act as king for Babylon as well, just like his father had. We don't hear about any particular drama. The Chaldeans down in the south appear to have been somehow restless, but Chaldeans are always restless. There may have been something more significant going on here, as Merodach-Baladan will take the Babylonian throne only 3 months after the death of Shalmaneser, but we can't really know. So, for all that we're about to make him sound really bad here, he's still administering the largest empire so far in all of human history without any sign that it was actively falling apart, which is probably better than I could manage. And we also know that he was spending his initial year undertaking some unclear set of reforms to domestic policy, like administration and economics. He may have attempted a redrawing of some province boundaries, though how extensive this was is unknowable, and he may have attempted to standardize taxation schemes, which might have had the practical impact of raising taxation on vassal kings, which is speculated to be part of why King Hoshea of Samaria stopped paying tribute. He may also have attempted other political matters that could have upset various factions within the palace, ultimately leading to his downfall, but the specifics of this are unclear. We've only got 2 solid threads to really tug at here. Now, first is that he didn't make his first full year the eponym year. Every year, going back well over a millennium at this point, they've been naming years after the holder of a certain ceremonial position called the Limmu official, who formally led some kind of ceremony. The details are really vague. They're not all that important here. It's not like a time-consuming job. It's more of like an honor, sort of like employee of the year for the Assyrian government. And for the last 2 centuries by now, the first or second year of a king's reign is always named for that king. Sometimes the king was busy on campaign and pushed their eponym year back a bit, but as far as we can tell, Shalmaneser wasn't in some faraway land for his first year and should have been able to take the honorary position as Limmu official. The fact that he didn't might mean that he was rethinking what the Limmu official should be doing, something that we'll see more fully evolve in the post-Sargon era, or it could mean that his transition wasn't nearly as stable as it looks from the outside. But if it does tie into his reforms, then he may have been radically reshaping the structure of the noble classes themselves, something his father had begun, and he may not have continued with the same level of adroitness and ruthless efficiency. Between the reforms of his father and the reforms of his successor, it's hard to say what, if anything, were his contributions, but for certain the Assyrian bureaucracy and noble classes were changing and would be radically different by the end of the next reign. And going beyond the officials themselves, the Limmu system is how the Assyrians counted the years. But after his successor, Sargon II, the Limmu year naming would become largely ceremonial, with more and more year dating occurring just by stating what year of the king they were in, a practice that had been common in Babylon since the Middle Bronze Age, and might have been influenced by the fact that Shalmaneser now held the title King of Babylon, nominally in equality with his title as King of Assyria. This calendar reform is usually ascribed to the Sargonids, but it may well originate with Shalmaneser V. And if I'm right that disruption to the calendar system was a contributor to the instability prior to Tiglath-Pileser, then it may well have worked against Shalmaneser, even if his aims within the administration were well intended. So that's one aspect of things. The other thread we have to tug on is the 16 lion weights of Shalmaneser. One of the most significant finds from his entire reign isn't really all that significant. It's just a bunch of carved lions of various sizes, and on the bottom it's stamped exactly what they weigh. As art, they're nice enough, and the stamps say things like, this one is a 2-shekel lion, which is about 36 grams. The largest of them is a 15 Mina lion, which is about 15 kilograms. And on the surface, they're basically just standardized weights, not really all that uncommon aside from their ornate decoration. Remember, there was not yet any coinage anywhere in the entire world, although the Lydians in Anatolia were only about a century away from figuring that out, and so all valuations in trade and tax were done by weight. When you read in the Old Testament about something costing 10 shekels, this isn't 10 coins, this is just a set of metal cut to about 180 grams, give or take a bit. And so having standard weights to know what was a mina and what was a shekel, and then what was 2/3 mina, what was 3 mina, 5 mina, and so on, that was important for doing business. So it's no surprise that the palace would have one, and indeed the palace probably had many. What makes these lion weights special, though, is that it talks about two different sets of weights. One set of weights talks about light minas, a mina that weighs about 470 grams, and calls it the mina of the land, while there's also a mina that weighs just a bit over 1 kilogram that's called mina of the king. Now, we're not totally sure, we don't have anything exactly spelling this out for us, but if this means what we think it means, then Shalmaneser attempted to redefine the standard weight system, more than doubling the meaning of mina, presumably without adjusting any contracts. If this is Shalmaneser's so-called tax reform, then just imagine that all your taxes next year get multiplied by a bit over 2, just because the president decided to redefine the dollar. Yes, we do have inflation now, which over the last century has actually been way worse than just a 50% cut in value. But Shalmaneser is operating in an environment where the standard weights and costs of things have been broadly stable since the beginning of civilization. The mina and the shekel are as old as anything in Mesopotamia, and while there has been, drift due to the lack of standardization, no one that we know of has ever tried anything quite as bold as this before. Now, it would also have meant that everyone the government pays, mostly the salaries of administrators, soldiers, and noblemen, would have doubled as well. But this reform was probably a genuine attempt to standardize and homogenize the empire. It wasn't just a cash grab, at least I hope not. The tributes demanded of each king were a patchwork of ad hoc agreements dating back to whenever each vassal had last submitted, and he probably wanted to continue his father's standardizing legacy by renegotiating every tributary's payment in the new denomination. But for all these good intentions, it probably would have had the effect of pulling additional money from payers of tribute and tax and giving that money to nobles, soldiers, and administrators. Implementation was attempted enough to at least cause some amount of rebellion, but at least by the time of Sargon II, everyone had politely forgotten about the whole notion, with standard weights afterwards returning to the customary lighter system. On the subject of tax standardization, thrilling tax standardization, the only thing that Sargon II accuses Shalmaneser V of directly is that he had insulted the sacred city of Ashur, the former capital, by ending various tax and levy exemptions that it had previously enjoyed. Now, the problem of this is that there is basically dispute among modern scholars about every single aspect of that statement. Had the city of Ashur previously been granted various tax exemptions? Did Shalmaneser actually revoke those privileges? There's debate around the whole accusation, but if true, it would indicate a king who was more interested in standardization than he was about the possibility that maybe everything in the ancient world didn't fit in a nice, neat, orderly box, which seems like it might have characterized Shalmaneser, a mediocre, bureaucratic mind, not equal to the enterprise and energy of Assyrian kingship. And really, that characterizes pretty much everything we know about his domestic policy. He seems to have focused a lot of his efforts on a variety of reforms that, for whatever reason, mostly served to irritate certain court factions, ultimately either caused his death or contributed to it, and either got lost in the much more consequential reigns he was sandwiched between, or got rolled back. We don't know how long he was in the business of pursuing his reforms, but by his second year, he's back on to the regular business of Assyrian kings, fighting wars. We know of 2 campaigns that he fought, one heading up into Anatolia and one down in Israel, and possibly a third on the coast, and they seem to learn some of his father's lessons in some very interesting ways, all while stubbornly failing to apply them properly. The first of these was probably the campaign to Israel. This campaign is interesting because it's the only event that the Babylonian chroniclers remember from his entire reign. Quite an interesting thing to note, given that Israel is so very far away from Babylon. Possibly it's because this was his first military campaign, and possibly because there were connections between Babylon and Israel due to the mass deportation of Babylonians and Kuthans to fill up newly conquered Samaria afterwards. It's actually from the Bible that we hear King Hoshea was upset about Assyrian taxation, which leads us to think he might have been, as a newly conquered subject, one of the first to be renegotiated with, and he seems to have crashed out pretty much right away. Our only source here is 2 Kings, and possibly a mention from the prophet Hosea, who is different from Hoshea, and the account is rather thin on the details, being much more concerned with its prophetic and theological implications. But if the ravager of Beth Arbel mentioned in Hosea chapter 10 is in fact this Shalmaneser, and not some other king of a similar name, then it was a merciless campaign, the sort that Assyria excelled at inflicting on its enemies. And also it's the sort of campaign that a new king who might have been under suspicions of weakness might have inflicted upon his enemies in order to demonstrate his brutality, and hence his strength. Either way, the campaign proceeded rather straightforwardly. The Samaritan rump state couldn't withstand the might of the Assyrian army, not even a fraction of it. I do say fraction because there's reason to think the army was split that year among multiple Levantine targets. The Jewish Roman historian Josephus cites a now lost Anatolian Greek historian who claims that Shalmaneser put Tyre to siege for 5 years. Now, most likely that 5 years is a bit fuzzy, either including the rebellions under Sargon or simply misremembered, because Shalmaneser simply hasn't got 5 years left. More to the point, we have multiple sources telling us that Shalmaneser attacked multiple Levantine nations early in the early part of his very short reign. And so if I may be so bold as to do a bit of guessing, I might reconstruct it something like this. Shalmaneser first attempted to pursue his tax reform and tax hike in the region that his father had most recently made a bunch of tributaries, the southern Levant. He probably thought that this region was likely to have at least a few rebels in it, but also that they would be militarily weak, a nice easy victory both for the king and his reform program as he marched in and crushed the rebels. And sure enough, at least Tyre and Israel rebelled, possibly also some other minor statelets. Then, in order to show off his command over the logistical flexibility that his father had pioneered, he orchestrated a split campaign, where the army arrived in the region, then divided up to simultaneously pursue multiple major regional targets. As an administrator by temperament, this was probably a way of leading armies that particularly suited him. He didn't need to be at every front line. Instead, he could manage the logistics to enable multiple simultaneous victories. And what a glorious triumph that will be when he goes back to his capital with multiple simultaneous victories under his belt. And, to an extent, he was exactly right in all of his assumptions. He appears to have rolled up the Tyrian and Israelite armies without much fuss. He organized some atrocities, he plundered and he despoiled, and he probably had enough to call it an inaugural victory. But there was one problem. Neither the king of Tyre nor of Israel had yet submitted to his new vassalage agreement. After all, neither capital had been taken. And Shalmaneser critically failed to learn a very key lesson from his father. The Assyrian military, as powerful as it was no longer able to crack the stone fortresses of that era. That doesn't mean it could never win a siege, even a siege assault, as there were many more factors in defense than just the walls and gates, like morale and security and preparation and terrain, but military technology has always been an arms race, with better attack leading to the development of better defense. Better defense, in this case, would lead to the Assyrians developing better attack again in turn, but Shalmaneser was not the one to lead that development. He was, as they say, behind the curve. Now, his father had begun to figure out how to win a war without directly winning every last siege through mobility and logistics and area denial, and we saw this last episode in the Syro-Ephraimite War, but Shalmaneser had not properly learned this, possibly indicating, again, that he might have been home in the capital while his father had been out on that particular war. And this was his inaugural campaign, with the casus belli of his tributary reform on the line. So he couldn't return home without having enforced his reform. How could he apply it nationwide without enforcing his will in this wretched backwater? And so he sent one army to sit on the city of Samaria, and simply never leave until it fell. And he sent another army to sit off the coast of Tyre until it fell. And then he went home for the year, without the fullness of a victory to claim, as significant chunks of the army were still out on deployment as 724 rolled in. Whatever the exact details of the campaign were, the fact that 725 ended like this was certainly destabilizing, an indictment of his competence and of his reform package, and of his divine favor. In 724, things were looking grim for Shalmaneser. He absolutely needed a win to secure his throne. And so this year he decides on a more traditional campaign, one of conquest, this time up in Anatolia. There may have been some northwest Neo-Hittite tributaries who rebelled, drawing the king's attention, but the only thing we know about specifically was that a fellow named Huli of Tabal, the northwestmost of the Neo-Hittite statelets, had been placed on the throne by Tiglath-Pileser, but then for some reason deposed by Shalmaneser and sent into exile. In that campaign, Shalmaneser marched through the vassal kingdoms of Samal and Kwe around Glycia and converted them into provinces. He conquered part of Hilaku, claimed it as part of Assyrian territory, and then changed the king of Tabal with one who would be more pliable, and then he returned home with plunder and treasure. And this, finally, would have been a victory worthy of an Assyrian king, and Shalmaneser was finally able to get his due recognition before the priests and nobles, claiming the next year, his 4th year, as his eponym year. It was a worthy victory. Some rebels had been smacked down, but at the same time, this is his high water mark, which, in comparison to the normal standard of Assyrian kings, is not a very high mark. Still, by this point, he has a victory, he has a reform package, and in 723 he goes out on another campaign somewhere. We have no idea where he went or if he was victorious. All we know is he didn't push the borders further on this expedition either, possibly because it was just another rebel hunt, or, more darkly, perhaps because the army was not victorious. Remember, as he's claiming his victory in Tabal, everyone in the homeland knows that his inaugural sieges of Samaria and Tyre have still not concluded. Other kings, stuck in multi-year sieges, focused all their attention on their target until it collapsed, but Shalmaneser, possibly attempting to emulate the flexibility his father displayed, continued moving soldiers around while still holding on to the sieges. And the thing is, there were ways to gracefully exit a siege. You could just say that you devastated the countryside, bring a little plunder home, and call it preparation for the next time you returned. Many kings of Assyria, great and not so great, have done exactly that. But by being stubborn, yet also not being victorious, yet also not putting all of his focus on the target, he's basically opening himself up to all sorts of criticism and all sorts of questions about his competence and about his divine favor. By 722, with his final 10 months as king coming up, it seems that Shalmaneser had finally accustomed at least a significant faction of the administration and nobility to his reign. Probably the increased pay from his monetary reforms helped a good deal, and for all that he had seen a pretty rocky start, he'd won at least one, and possibly now up to 3 minor military campaigns. He might not be as obviously impressive as some of the great kings of Assyrian history, but the argument could probably be made that he was shaping up to be at least adequate. On the other hand, there was certainly an anti-Shalmaneser faction at the same time. He'd seen some significant losses, or at least we could call them failures to fully succeed. He had possibly increased taxes on formerly exempt populations in Ashur itself, as well as definitely increased taxes on quite a lot of other people, and the accusation was floating around for various possible reasons that he had offended the gods. Fortunately, just as these accusations were swirling around, news arrived in Kalhu that Samaria had fallen to Assyrian might. Plunder and slaves were already arriving, and some initial governance was being arranged, beginning the process of integrating the Assyrian province of Samaria and sending loyal Babylonians to colonize parts of the region. But it was too little, too late. Tyre was still under siege when the armies were recalled just before the new year as part of the power struggle, living proof that it was possible to successfully resist the Assyrian army even without being as powerful as Urartu. There is a theory that Shalmaneser died of natural causes in January of 721, And to be fair, there is no definitive proof that he died of any particular reason. Far more often, however, it's assumed that he was killed, either directly or indirectly, by a political rival probably, a man of deeply uncertain origins whose name is not even known, despite being far and away the most well-documented figure in the whole of the ancient Near East, and the first to be discovered by archaeology. That's right. We're entering the Sargonid era, the most well-studied and detailed period of Assyrian history. So join us next time for the mysterious origins and bloody reemergence of a man remembered to history only as the true king. And if you've been enjoying this, consider dropping a little like and sharing it around. I have a Patreon if you want to support me there, and 2 books you can buy, History and Myth from Sumer and Akkad, and History and Myth from Babylon and the Amorites, both available on Amazon. Thank you for your support, and thank you for listening.